Hello, Brooklyn College and the rest of the world. I hope this forthcoming conversation finds you well. We are going to give the audience a minute to settle in before we start. So just bear with us for half a minute. All right, that should be enough time. I'm Nadav Raz, the treasurer of the undergraduate student government at Brooklyn College and the moderator of this event. This evening's talk will begin with a keynote address by our guest, followed by an interview and ending with a Q&A for the audience. I now introduce you to our prized guest, one of the world's most distinguished scholars and a best-selling author. He is the chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, and more importantly, an inspiration to all those people, myself included, who have been touched by his work. I am proud to introduce you to Eddie S. Glaude Jr.
Thank you so much, Nadav. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with you to begin a conversation. I hope we will have a great exchange and dialogue about our current moment. I look forward to it. So let me try to offer a few kind of framing remarks, and then we can get into the conversation and move from there. Is that okay? So let me just do that. I also want to thank Ethan and Ikura and Aaron, everybody behind the scenes who are making this moment possible. We always have to shine light on the invisible labor that makes these sorts of moments possible. So we want to lift them up and all the work that they've done to make this event happen. Last night we heard President Biden deliver his speech to the Congress. And it was a fascinating moment. And it reminded me of a book written in 1927 by John Dewey entitled Public and Its Problems, The Public and Its Problems. And in this text, Dewey makes a particular claim that I find fascinating, that is at the heart of one of my books entitled In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America. And Dewey talks about the kind of eclipse of a public, that moment when one public is going out of view and another is desperately trying to come into view. And that kind of moment of discord, that disjunction, where a language that was developed under a particular set of material conditions no longer fit what is emerging, but we're not quite sure what that new way of being together will look like. Last night, President Biden tried to, in so many ways, shift the center of gravity of our politics. And no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, what you should have heard, at least in my view, was a rejection of the basic assumptions of Reaganism. The assumption that big government by definition is bad, and the assumption that tax policy should favor those who have over and against those who do not. A new and different social contract where we move from being kind of self-interested persons in pursuit of our own aims and ends, in competition and rivalry with others, and instead to understand ourselves in communion with each other, different sort of mutuality, and what that would involve or entail. In many ways, President Biden, and I'm to the left of President Biden, offered a kind of moral and social contract, which involved in some ways an explicit statement about our values. Now, of course, this occurred against the backdrop of a nation in crisis, not only in terms of COVID-19 with over 570,000 of our fellow Americans dead, but also the fact that in this economy, even though there is a kind of bounce back, it is a K-shaped recovery, that those at the top are benefiting while many at the bottom are struggling to keep their noses above water. But it's also this kind of cultural cleavage, the violence of white supremacy, the threat, right, of it seems the country coming apart at the seams, alongside of, the reality of police violence, the ongoing killings of Black and brown folk. So we find ourselves, and there's no other reasonable way to and there's no reasonable way to deny this, in a moment of profound transition. America's changing, and the substance of that transformation is not clear, at least to me, it isn't. Who we will be has yet come into view. Remember Dewey's analogy of the eclipse of a public. But what remains are the shards of what has been shattered. I mean, think about what we witnessed in the Derek Chauvin trial. He was found guilty on all 3 counts. I was stunned because of what I can call a kind of earned skepticism, as it were. You know, I did not believe that the courts would hold a police officer accountable for the death of a Black person. Our lives, the evidence suggested, did not matter in this way. But Chauvin was convicted, cuffed, and walked out of that courtroom. But we've come to find out since that verdict, not only did Ma'Khia Bryant die at the hands of the police, Mario Gonzalez died with the knee in his back minutes before the verdict was announced. Now, we're changing. But America changes all the time, Baldwin says, but never changes, but rarely changes at all. James Baldwin once said that we are still governed by the slave codes in this country. And I think the point was deliberately provocative. He's not suggesting here that Black people are still slaves or that the police are slave catchers. Rather, he dramatically reveals what is at the heart of our treatment, right? That some people in this country are valued more than others, while others are treated with a generalized sense of disregard. That valuation, especially in the hands of police, can be lethal, has been lethal, continues to be lethal. And there's much more that has to be said and much more that has to be done than just simply passing the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We have to dismantle the discursive framework within which we understand policing. We have to move from law and order to something like safety and security, but I'll say a little bit more about that later. In many ways, what we have witnessed over the last few months, what you have witnessed over the last few months, the insurrection on January 6th, the spate of voting laws across 47 states, the violent assault against Asian Americans, the debate around immigration, all of this, it seems to me, has a kind of panic at its root about the changing nature of our country, about this eclipse of publics. There are those who cleave to the idea that ours must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe, that some among us, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more. That those people have a different sense of possession of the country, while the rest of us should shut up and be grateful. It is an idea as old as the Republic. It is the serpent that has threatened to swallow this fragile experiment whole every generation. It is what undermines our very conception of democracy itself. We must admit, Nadav, I think, and we do so at our peril, that racial inequality in this country is not the result of random events. Ours is the country we have made. Racial inequality is the result of a collection of bad choices on the part of various individuals. It is the consequence of policy decisions, of deliberate efforts to build a society that instantiates the value gap. Ours has been, in so many ways, a Herrenvolk democracy, a democracy for some, while the rest of us, as I said, must shut up and be grateful. Think about the policies of the New Deal. Black folks systematically locked out by Southern Democrats and their allies. Think about the benefits of the GI Bill. Black veterans locked out because of systemic racism that barred them from accessing those benefits. A dual housing market, a dual labor market, residential segregation, banking policy, segregated schools. All of this is as a result of deliberate policy decisions. Racial inequality is not something that just happened. And if I'm right, and the historical evidence is clear, I believe, The only way we're going to remedy racial inequality, that inequality that threatens to snuff out American democracy, the only way we're going to reinvent democracy is to admit that we created racial inequality, that it is the result of our choices, and we have to be just as deliberate in getting rid of it. To echo Dr. King, we will have to engage in a revolution of value, a revolution of value. We will have to commit ourselves to building a country that affirms the dignity and sacrality of every human being, no matter the color of their skin, their zip code, or where they're from, who they love, their gender or ability. It will involve finally uprooting the idea that some among us, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. A revolution of value would seek to uproot those ways of seeing and living that enable Americans to hold commitments to racial equality and live in ways that suggest they believe otherwise. It is a revolution to close the value gap, right? To finally rid the country of these inwards, of these needs for others. And it involves, right, I believe, a change in how we view government, a change in how we view Black people, and a change in how we view what ultimately matters to us as Americans. And these shifts are not abstract considerations. They get to the marrow of what blocks the way to real democratic transformation in this country. And they will require political mobilization and massive disruption of the status quo. It will require a radical reordering of value. We have to change what matters to us as Americans. And I'm not suggesting that we discard cherished notions of success and reliance, but a revolution of value should change what constitutes success in individual initiative. The value of human beings should never be diminished in the pursuit of profit or in the name of an ideology. Something about the way we see the world is out of whack. People profiting from the incarceration of millions, corporations making money off the sick, children dying in poverty. And you saw last night a political party not celebrating, not excited about the idea of cutting child poverty in the country in half. If we're going to change how we view Black people in this country, we're going to have to change how we view white people. We're going to have to finally put to bed this idea that because of the color of one's skin, one must be valued more than another. And we're going to have to change our view of government. Government is only as good as what we demand of it, what we ask of it. The government is not the play toy of corporations and the rich. If it is, then we're no longer a democracy, it seems to me. Now, all of this is hard work. To do this, to engage in this revolution of value is hard work. We have to tell ourselves the truth about what we've done and who we are. That truth or better acceptance becomes the basis for a different way of being together. But it is hard to tell ourselves the truth about who we are. We would rather affirm our goodness, safety, and security and comfort are found there. But in doing so, we remain permanently docked at the station, doing the same damn thing over and over again. Wash, rinse, and repeat, yes? But if we're going to come through this moment really transformed, if President Biden's imaginings are going to be pushed to radically reimagine the country, we're finally going to have to get out of history's ass pocket. We're going to have to uproot the value gap. We're going to have to tell ourselves the truth. We cannot tell ourselves the story of American virtue that secures our innocence. Baldwin put it right in The Fire Next Time. It is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence that constitutes the crime. Baldwin relentlessly exposed the idea, the lies that America told itself. In an essay published in 1964 entitled Nothing Personal, he put it this way, and I think it's succinct, right? We are, quote, afraid to reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves so little. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. We live by lies, Baldwin says. And not only, for example, about race, but about our very natures. The lie has penetrated, excuse me, the lie has penetrated our most private moments and the most secret chambers of our hearts, Baldwin wrote. This country has never been a beacon of virtue. It's not an example of democracy achieved, nor is it the shining city on the hill. We didn't need President Biden's, American exceptionalism to put us on the path to reimagining our being together. We tell ourselves these lies in order to protect ourselves from what we've done. Problem we face in the United States go beyond who occupies the White House or the latest example of American racism. We have to get to the rot at the heart of the matter if we're going to really, really become a genuinely multiracial democracy. We have to tap the root. And this requires, in my view, that we deconstruct all that the nation holds sacred. Tell the truth so that we might release ourselves into a different way of being in the world. Americans are trapped in a history we refuse to know, but carry within us. The terrors and panic we experience have everything to do with the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who deep down we really are. That the nation actively evades confronting this gap locks the country into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of New World Eden refuse to grow up. And for Baldwin, condemnation to eternal youth is a synonym for corruption. Imagine being stuck forever in Never Never Land. Forever lost boys and lost girls who refuse to be held to account, who refuse to embrace responsibility. I can't help but link this insight to what we've experienced over the last 4 years. Americans who cling to this myth that America must be a white nation in the vein of old Europe. Those underneath, those who hold this view, and underneath their rants and hatreds is this panic that the country is shifting, that it's changing. Underneath a cheap-ass MAGA hat and t-shirt is this belief that America is finally becoming something that they dare not embrace. And these people are willing to throw democracy into the trash bin in the name of this old idea. This is hard work. Tell the truth. To imagine a genuinely multiracial democracy, shorn of the belief that some, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. To imagine a democracy without the understanding that there are some among us who should shut up and be grateful. To imagine a democracy where no one requires enemies in order to be truly themselves. To imagine a democracy where we don't think of values, our goods, and the burdens and benefits of citizenship in terms of a zero-sum game. Some will have to lose while others gain. We have to reject this framing because it is based on a view of scarcity that presupposes that advantage ought to accrue to a narrow group among us. We have to break the back of this if we are to imagine America anew. So how are we stepping up? President Biden last night gave us a vision. You don't have to agree with it all. Some of us wish he would go even farther. But we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing in this moment that requires of each of us acceptance and risk to imagine America anew? We must accept who we are, I think, and risk being otherwise. And I don't ask the question for people to virtue signal, for people to declare their liberal bona fides. I am with Baldwin on this one. I'm skeptical of people who want to do something for me. I want people to do something with me, and that is to imagine America anew. How do we build the modern world's first genuinely multiracial democracy? What must we do? We must risk everything, finally, to put the sin of racism behind us and figure out how to be together differently. And that will be hard work, but we have to tell the truth. Uproot the value gap. Create a space where the full diversity of America lives and breathes. Enact a way of living together that emerges organically from the depth of our difference, to enact a revolution of value, change our view of government, change our view of Black people by finally putting in the grave this view of white people, which needs the old Negro, right? And change what ultimately matters to us. In order to do this, we all must show up and risk ourselves in this moment. We must risk everything. We must push the politicians because they inevitably disappoint. Our faith must not reside in them, must reside in us. And who knows, we might very well get it right this time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eddie. That was great.
Thank you, Nadav. I appreciate you, man.
So now we're going to transition to the interview section of this event.
Sure.
I just want to go off what you were originally talking about, the Chauvin trial.
Yeah.
You think if there was not such a uprising at the beginning of last summer and it sustained itself, though, less successfully throughout the summer, do you think if we did not have that, Derek Chauvin would have been in prison?
I don't think he would have. You have to think about the confluence of forces that resulted or led to this decision. Not only did you have to have the video footage of Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old who, despite all that was happening around her, she continued to videotape or to capture on camera what was happening. That footage, along with all of the other things, the protests, the officers, the witnesses, when you think about the constellation of evidence that was needed to convict what seems to the reasonable person, what an obvious guilt, it seems to me. It leads one to conclude rather reasonably that if it wasn't for the protest, the massive protest, in the middle of a pandemic, by the way, that Chauvin would not have been convicted. I don't think he would have been indicted. If you remember, think about the initial press release from the Minneapolis Police Department. Right? There was a medical condition. It wasn't anything about this. Only until Darnella put it up on Facebook Live did we get any outrage.
So to transition to our next question, while reading the book Begin Again, Your Story of James Baldwin, I was struck by the realization that this was, on its deepest level, a spiritual book. I was also struck by its intense focus on the language and ideas of love and empathy versus the language and ideas of God. While I'm not the expert, obviously, that you are with Baldwin's oeuvre, how do you reconcile his blistering attacks on the church as an institution of white supremacy and terror with your view of the spiritual Baldwin?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. I mean, but think about it. Let me come at it by way of an example. One of the classic works in the philosophy of religion was written by William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And what William James does at the beginning of that book is that he says, look, I'm not talking about the church and dogma. I want to talk about religious experience. So he makes this distinction. Now, the distinction is rooted in the decidedly Protestant emphasis of the text, right? So he holds Catholicism at bay. He wants to hold a kind of Durkheimian view at arm's length. Baldwin makes a similar distinction, right? If you read The Fire Next Time, he understands the church becomes his gimmick, his way of holding off the dangers of the hood, because Baldwin grew up in the Hollow, not in Sugar Hill of New York, but the Hollow, right? He grew up in the hood in some ways. And the church kept him from, as he says, from being consumed by the streets. But then he realized that the Black church, his church, was still overdetermined by the realities of American racism, right? That as much as it provided him with a language to understand himself, it was still shaped by the reality of a society organized along the lines of the value gap. So Baldwin asked that very provocative question in The Fire Next Time. If God doesn't make you more expansive and more loving, then it's time we got rid of it. He makes that formulation. And so by the time you get to Crush a Serpent, the last essay published in Playboy magazine after his death in 1987, Baldwin is responding to the moral majority, the Jerry Falwells, the Pat Robertses, who have used the gospel to sanctify a particular kind of hateful politics, right? And what he tries to offer is this sermon around the relationship between love and salvation. So love and salvation isn't reducible to dogma. It's not reducible to institutions, right? It is a way of being in the world, how one stands in relation to one's fellows who are also children of God. And it's in that space of vulnerability, of mutuality, of love that salvation is found. See, but it still bears the imprimatur of Baldwin's early formation in Pentecostal church, a storefront Pentecostal church in New York. And of course, the Baptist tradition out of which he comes to.
So you always considered him something of a pastor, right?
Well, he started out as a young, a youth pastor. So yeah, he's always engaged in some kind of ministerial work. That's the kind of prophetic, how would one call it? The prophetic arc of his work in some ways. Yeah.
The book deals with the reality of what it means to be someone who has been traumatized by history. There's a quote by Baldwin in your book from what I believe is a short film shot during his time in Istanbul, where he states, "I am generally very alone. I've got a lot on my mind, not exactly alone, but not really present. This theme of fragmentation, of feeling, as you write, elsewhere, at all times, is this constant variable seen and felt in every individual who has been victimized by the forces of history." Could you explain how you got to this realization and how it helps you understand the world?
Well, it certainly, first of all, just a wonderful read. I'm trying to make sense of Baldwin at a very vulnerable moment. King is assassinated in April of '68. And Baldwin collapses. It's a failed relationship because he always felt that he wasn't lovable, that he couldn't be loved because of a wounding at childhood, as a child. And he tries to commit suicide in '69. And he's trying to pick up the pieces in Istanbul. That wonderful film by Sadat Peké captures, I think, the pathos, the suffering, the tenderness, the love, right? And so I focus and begin again in this moment of betrayal and collapse, this the later Baldwin, where he's lived through the height of the civil rights movement, of the Black freedom struggle, and he's witnessed and witnessing the country betray the sacrifices of people he loved. He's witnessing the country double down on its ugliness. And that's traumatic. And so he's trying to find, at least I believe, at the level of form, how to capture that trauma on the page, how to capture that wounding on the page. And here I am in our moment, this moment right now, trying to figure out what the hell is this place doing? What are these people doing? It feels in my gut that some white Americans have lost their damn minds, right? And how traumatic that is. Can you imagine having to watch this death on loop and worry about your son and worry about your brother, worry about your husband, worry about your wife, worry about people you love? I mean, on loop. And so I think part of what I was trying to do in sitting with Baldwin in this period is to figure out how to find the resources to pick up the pieces in the face of it all. Right. And that's where I found Begin Again, you see, if I'm answering the question. But I think the first thing is to acknowledge the pain, to recognize the trauma and the wound. Right.
You have many names for what you consider America's original sin to be, including what you would call the lie. How do you think Americans who already recognize what this original sin is can help other Americans realize it as well?
Expose the truth when the lie is being told, right? To say, no, that's not quite right. No. I mean, you see it in real time, for example, right? So just a quick example, you see the 1619 Project of the New York Times. And you can have all sorts of disagreements with the 1619 Project as an origin story. But in reality, what I think Nicole Hannah-Jones was trying to do was to say, what happens if we begin here as opposed to there? It's like what the late Edward Said you said in his book Beginnings, right? That where one begins is the beginning of where one begins is the beginning of the problem, where you start. So if you start the story of the United States with the Jamestown Project, what comes into view? Well, America was a corporation before it was a country. What else comes into view? Slavery, because they're slaves. What else comes into view? Native peoples, indentured servitude, class differences, right? And what else comes into view? Failure. But at the very moment in which the 1619 Project offers us a different beginning, we get a reassertion of the lie with the 1776 Project, aimed to telling a story to protect us from our sins, to maintain our innocence, as it were, right? So I think the short answer to your question, Rob, is that, what can we do in the face of these stories that try to secure America's virtue is not necessarily reveal our sins, but to complicate the narrative, right? To tell the truth as we see it in those moments. That's what we have to do if we're going to invent, not necessarily invent democracy, but reimagine
it. You mentioned the loop that Baldwin faced, and you would use the term after times a lot to describe the sort of destruction of the civil rights movement and how he dealt with that. Every time I read that, I felt like it was a synonym for hell, like you were describing hell.
Yeah. It feels like it sometimes, yes. And
Yeah.
and if you remember in the book, there's an invocation of Dante over and over, Dante's Inferno, T.S. Eliot's a translation of a line from Dante's Inferno. So there is a sense in which the ongoing betrayal, these cycles of betrayal, right? And the death that follows them. So I want to be very clear that the betrayals aren't abstractions. They're bodies left in the wake,
You mentioned probably the most brutal for me reading that book was you mentioned, I'm going to mess up the exact story, but how Baldwin goes back to the South, I believe. And I'm going to mess up the names, but it's the story of the 3 civil rights workers who were killed.
Yeah,
And the
Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, right?
Yeah, and you're telling how when the police, I guess maybe it was the police or the state troopers, they were bringing up the bodies, that they couldn't tell if they were the civil rights movement workers or just Black people who've been lynched. And it was, that line, it's like, it doesn't matter at this point.
Yeah, this is Dave Dennis, who worked with CORE in Mississippi, speaking to Jimmy in the documentary film, I Heard It Through the Grapevine. And he's telling the story about them dredging the Mississippi, and coming up with all of these bodies, beheaded, people who tried to vote, people whose names we don't know. And he says, and we're still looking for these 3 civil rights workers. And he was like, for what? What does this mean? Right. And it's this powerful moment in the film where Dennis believes that the nation had made a choice that it could not come back from, that it couldn't bounce back from, that it had chosen not to commit itself to any genuine sense of democracy in relation to Black folk in this country. And it's a very, very powerful moment. And then Baldwin, in interesting ways, responds to him by saying that he drew that conclusion after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in response to the March on Washington. Right? He drew that conclusion. But both of them did not know that Barack Obama was on the horizon and what that would mean.
Yeah, and this is something I knew about before I read the book, but I remember feeling infuriated when I found out that the people who committed the crimes were not really punished. They got light sentences, and then I think they lived pretty decent lives for mass murderers.
Mm-hmm.
That's that right there should be all you need to know about the American justice system.
Yeah, and and we have to. When I wrote in Time magazine after the Chauvin trial, that there were ghosts. I imagined ghosts dancing around the courtroom. The ghost of our dead who never received justice, right? But then I ended the piece with reference to Micaiah Bryant, wondering if her ghost would show up to the next trial. And you notice the next trial, right? We have been waiting. Well, waiting is not the right word. We have been living amid this ongoing disaster and burying our dead over and over again.
One of Baldwin's great rhetorical accomplishments throughout his career is how he switches the burden of freedom back onto white America. His point being that the real wretched of the earth are not the victims of America, but its perpetrators. But alas, this does not seem to solve the problem of how to convince poor, working class, or disaffected white Americans that they are not, in fact, America's greatest victims. Is this a problem we even need to solve?
How we solve it is the question. Yes, we need to break the back of this idea of whiteness. We need to finally bury it, kill it, put it in the ground forever. How do we kill this idea of whiteness that has distorted and disfigured not only American democracy, but in so much the principles of enlightenment, the principles of liberalism, so much of the modern world? Baldwin has this line where he says, I'm not the N-word. I've never been the N-word, never thought of myself as such. The question is, why do you need the N-word? Until you answer that question, I'll give the N-word back to you, baby. Who's the N-word for real, right? To paraphrase him. So there's this sense in which Baldwin, at the heart of Baldwin's corpus, is this radical inversion. The problem is not me. It's never been us. Problem is you.
And that's what you. Sorry, but that's what you term this like a Socratic sort of dialogue that he has with himself and that he demands of everyone else.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. That inversion is key, so that the problem doesn't reside here, because the world wants us to believe that we're the problem. Think about that opening line in Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, right? What does it feel like to be a problem? Right? I'm not the problem. I'm not a problem. You are. Right? And that's not just a facile inversion, right? It's actually descriptively right. And so that shift, right, means that we have to deconstruct the very conceptions or ideas of whiteness that have led to the construction of the world as it is. Because it's that valuation that actually distorts democratic principles, such that people like Abraham Lincoln cannot become the kinds of persons his very conception of democracy requires. He can't be the kind of human being that his idea of democracy requires, precisely because he's committed to the idea that white people, right, hold, ought to be valued more, have different capacities. Even Walt Whitman, think about it. Walt Whitman, in Leaves of Grass, publishes in the first edition of Leaves of Grass, You have an abolitionist sections in the poem. He's anti-slavery. But post-emancipation, he starts redacting elements of the poem because he doesn't believe Black people have the capacities to bear the burden of citizenship. You read his op-eds in the Brooklyn newspapers, he thinks we're barbarians, incapable of bearing the burdens of citizenship. So by the last edition of Leaves of Grass, he's redacted all of that out.
I did not know that. That's not a common story people tell about Walt Whitman, that he couldn't give up his hate of Black people.
Well, he didn't think we had the capacities to be citizens. And so here you have the bard of democracy, Walt Whitman. Here you have Lincoln, right? The president that ushers in the second founding, and both of them are limited in their conceptions of democracy by their understandings of whiteness. How can we reimagine ourselves shorn of this belief?
And that's the
key.
That's the power that Baldwin's creativity presents. Amid all, he's fighting back against the definition of himself that he didn't create. So he gets to create it himself.
Which I love. He's saying, he says in the uses of the blues, and I'm paraphrasing here, whatever you think the Negro problem is, it is rooted in this idea that we have to raise our children in a world that despises them. And we have to teach them not to despise themselves. So what Du Bois says in Souls of Black Folk, this two unreconciled strivings, right? These two warring souls, right? Acquires another level of intensity, is experienced at a different level, at a different register, because double consciousness, right? It's not only just seeing oneself through the eyes of another, right? It's taking root, and it becomes the context within which one tries to create a self, right? And so what does it mean to try to imagine oneself in the most expansive of terms in a world that believes you're just simply the inward?
And it would also seem that reading your book, that his more in the early years, in the 50s, he was a little more held back. But even with that, it would seem that he had a great influence on the Black Power movement in the mid and late 60s, that without him, that they may not have been able to be anything, because without his reimagining of what it means to be Black in America, they might have not been able to do it themselves. But they also never really accepted him.
Yeah, so I wouldn't go as far as to say that Black Power wouldn't have been possible without Baldwin.
Okay.
He's not singular in this inversion. He just, I think, gives it voice in ways that we hadn't heard before. Baldwin, it goes to, takes a major risk in embracing Black Power. But he told those young students, as I began the book, he told those young students at Howard, if you promise me that you won't believe what the world says about you, I promise you that I'll never betray you. And in that group, late in the midnight hour, was Stokely Carmichael and Cortland Cox and Muriel Tillinghast and Michael Thelwell and those folks who would go on to be proponents of Black Power. But the folks, Baldwin found himself caught betwixt and between. But he peeped this early, though. If you read Alas, Poor Richard, published in Nobody Knows My Name in 1961, he talks about how Richard Wright became the object of criticism and scorn of the younger generation. And he knew that it was going to happen to him. So when Eldridge Cleaver criticizes Baldwin as the most self-hating Negro he had ever read in Soul on Ice, when Eldridge Cleaver questions his manhood, right, by telling people that he just simply wanted to be, wanted to have sex with white men, right? It hurt Baldwin to the core, but, he continued to bear witness, never betrayed them. And the irony, of course, is that when you look at when Eldridge Cleaver and Bobby Hutton have their encounter with the police in Oakland, right? And Bobby Hutton is killed. Eldridge Cleaver has to go into exile, and the Panthers are trying to raise money for him. Baldwin's at the top of the list of the donors.
He's a special man, or he was.
Indeed.
The title of this event comes from a famous quote by Baldwin: "Hope is invented every day." It is also a major theme of the book of Beginning Again. You write, "Jimmy always believed we could be better than what we are. He also understood that the battle to choose life was fought every day, and imagination was one of his most potent weapons. How do we take this decision to live, to imagine anew, and create a material reality out of it, a political reality, if you will? How are we supposed to invent democracy, according to Baldwin?"
To run towards the world that we want, that we desire, to confront our fears, right? To actually just simply, with all our might, fight for it. So, when Baldwin says hope is invented every day, it is a profound utterance that reveals that if you have to invent hope every day, that means you have to hold off despair every day, trying to beat it back. You're trying to swing your feet off the bed and plant them on the floor so that you can get up and push this damn boulder up the hill again, right? And what Baldwin is saying, at least to my mind, as I read him in those moments, right, is that this idea of democracy, right, requires of us not only an acceptance of who we are, but a willingness to risk ourselves in pursuit of it. Right? We have to risk everything, right? To imagine an otherwise, and to make it happen. How do we do it? Together, in solidarity with others. That's how we do it.
And you tie together that idea of love to that of mutuality and ultimately democracy. You quote Ralph Ellison: "The way home we seek is that condition of one being at home in the world, which is called love, and we term democracy." This seems to be the unifying message of the book, that democracy and love are ultimately one and the same. How would you explain that to someone unfamiliar with the book or these ideas?
It's basic. If you come out of the Christian tradition, it's do unto others as you would, have done, that the golden rule, right? If you believe in the sacrality of human being, it means that you affirm the dignity and standing of people who are right in front of you. Right? You create the conditions under which people can not only dream dreams, but to make those dreams a reality, right? To become the people that they imagine themselves to be. So, love is not some sentimental notion, right? Love is exacting. It demands something of you. Baldwin puts it this way, right? In at the end of Fire Next Time, it says the relatively conscious blacks and conscious whites who, and then he puts, like lovers, must risk everything, right? Now, what does he mean by like lovers? That's not agape. That's not philia. That's eros. And what is it about eros? It's about vulnerability. It's about like standing in front of one's lover with no clothes, and she could see all of, or he could see all of your blemishes, all your faults, all your your misgivings, everything is on full view. So love is also about a deep vulnerability with others. And it's in that vulnerability that the bridge, right, to the other, and in one's suffering, right, one finds connection.
But on the flip side of this pain and vulnerability, there is the ever-growing threat and normalization of what you term the people who repeatedly choose the safety of being white over a more just society. In the context of this safety, how are you feeling about President Biden? I know you just talked about him, but you seem more optimistic than I was expecting. Is there a reason for that, or are you just trying to be hopeful?
Well, it's not so much being optimistic. It's really just kind of noting what I heard. And for 40 years, we have been governed under the assumptions of Reaganism, right? And what that meant, a certain conception of government, limited government. That meant an insistence on the role of markets, expansive role of markets in our public life. That meant a certain understanding of policing and the like. It meant a certain view of domestic and foreign policy in particular, although Biden hasn't changed that at all. He's actually trying to recover it. So part of what I was trying to note is that Biden understands that we have to shift the ground, right, of our being together, that Reaganism has revealed itself as bankrupt. He said explicitly, trickle-down economics has not worked.
I mean,
Now,
you put it beautifully about what his election campaign. I always love this. Republicans and even Democrats, they don't fail from like the period of like 1972 to 1996 to dog whistle racism. It's like every one of them. And in
every one of them.
Every one of them. And in you talked about how Reagan went to a few miles outside of where those civil rights people were murdered. I'm sorry, I forgot their name. I just don't remember them. And he talked about states' rights, which sort of became the new way of forming that lie.
Right. Yeah. And so Reaganism has had as one of its pillars an exploitation of white resentment, white grief, white fear. Right. It's been part of the politics, right? And it's not just Republicans. I mean, Bill Clinton announces his tough on crime legislation in front of a prison near Stone Mountain, with images of Black people, Black men in particular, in prison uniforms, striped prison uniforms, right? So this
Pretty
is
sure
not
he approved the execution of a mentally disabled Black man.
Absolutely. So this is not just a Republican story. This is the way in which our politics have been constituted. So I'm not trying to oversell President Biden, because let me tell you something. If Reaganism is collapsed, as I've suggested, that means a version of the Democratic Party constituted in response to Reaganism is also collapsed. Right? The very way in which a certain understanding of the Democratic Party as Republican light, right, that has to collapse too. Right? So part of what I'm suggesting here is that in this inflection point, we have an opportunity to imagine ourselves differently. And particularly your generation. You guys have grown up in, shall we say, cascading catastrophes.
Yeah, that's accurate.
I mean, you have, since the moment you have witnessed the world, right? Think about what you've seen.
It's a lot of junk, a lot of garbage.
A lot of junk, so the place is broken. But some of you are reaching for old languages, like fascism, while others are reaching for, what you want to describe them as, progressive languages or whatever, are trying to imagine the country. But there is a sense in which what is broken. And your generation, I think, clearly understands that. And you're grasping for a different kind of vocabulary. Remember how we began. The eclipse of a public means that what languages developed under one set of material conditions can't speak to the new conditions. So we need new languages, as it were, you see. And that's what I see your generation reaching for. Maybe I'm wrong, but who knows?
Well, we're trying our best, I think. Here's my final question. You write about how Baldwin rejected appeals to solidarity based on some essential fixed idea of Blackness. The particular histories and experiences of Black people mattered more than the idea of race. Baldwin insisted that Black people should not get hung up on, quote, some mystical Black bullshit. That's how the whole fucking nightmare started. Yeah. Baldwin writes that we find ourselves bound first without, then within, by the nature of categorizations. Baldwin continues, Perhaps the whole root of our trouble, the human trouble, is that we will sacrifice all the beauty of our lives, will imprison ourselves in totems, taboos, crosses, blood sacrifices, steeples, mosques, races, armies, flags, nations, in order to deny the fact of death, which is the only fact we have. I find this all to be quite a breathtaking analysis of the human condition. But how do you suppose we fight this urge to immortalize ourselves? Is it not a basic part of human nature to reproduce, not just biologically, but socially?
You know, I don't, these categories, as Baldwin renders it, become another form of Weber's iron cage, limiting and confining our individual conceptions of ourselves. Right? We understand, it's like Baldwin resisting being limited to being a homosexual, quote unquote. That's his language, right? What does it mean to find oneself, one's desire limited by these categories, even as he understands the political work that has to be done in dismantling the very ways in which desire is policed. Because the categories can then in turn reify the very thing that you're fighting against, you see. There is a kind of humanism in Baldwin that is rooted in a kind of passionate embrace of his own individuality that cannot be lost, right? That refuses to be lost. Right? And I think, but it's understood within community. This individual is not untethered from history, is not right singular in the sense that she is not a product of social circumstances, that she doesn't have a language. It's like Baldwin saying he could not finish Go Tell It on the Mountain until he could listen to Betty Smith records, until he could get the language of home in, you know, that was in his head, right? Right, because he's bound to a community, but he's not reducible to it. Individuality within community. One of the ways John Dewey writes about this in Individualism, Old and New, right? But there's this moment though in No Name in the Street where he writes, Black is a tremendous spiritual condition. One of the greatest challenges anyone alive can face. This is what the Blacks are saying. But to be liberated from the stigma of Blackness by embracing it is to cease forever one's interior agreement and collaboration with the authors of one's degradation. It abruptly reduces the white enemy to a contest merely physical, which he can win only physically. And then he goes on to say, and as the Black glories in his newfound color, which is his at last, and asserts not always with the very greatest politeness, the unanswerable validity and power of his being, the white is very often affronted and very often made afraid. He has his reasons after all, not only for being weary of the entire concept of color, but fearful as to what may be made of this concept once it has fallen, as it were, into the wrong hands. And here he goes. And one may indeed be wary, but the point is that it was inevitable that Black and white should arrive at this dizzying height of tension. Only when we have passed through this moment will we know what our history has made of us. So just like Marx will argue that we have to go through class to get beyond it, Baldwin is saying we have to go through this confrontation to get beyond it, right? What awaits us on the other side, I'm not sure, and neither was he.
Yeah. He's probably our best critic.
To my mind, he is up there with, he is the best critic of the vexing question of race and democracy that we've produced, yes.
Okay, thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Glaude. We're going to move on to this last part before we finish. It's
Sure.
going to be an audience Q&A.
Sure.
So for our first question, we have Gabriela Flores, a sophomore and a writer for our student newspaper, the Brooklyn College Vanguard. Aaron, do you mind?
Yep, bring her up. Hey, Gabriella.
Yes, hello.
Hello, Gabriela.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for being here with us. I had a few questions for you. Mostly I wanted to ask, given the state that we are in currently, how do you think that the transition to a multiracial democracy will look like?
I'm not sure yet. You know, the only analogy I can give you, Gabriella, is that of a storm. You know, we are still in the eye of the storm. The tail is coming. You know, I grew up on the Gulf Coast, so I know a little bit about hurricanes. So the eye of the storm gives you a sense of calm, but the tail is very violent as the front end of the storm. So we're in the eye of it. So I'm not sure what it will look like. We still have forces out here who are clinging to this idea that the nation must remain a white nation. We have other forces that are clinging to an economic philosophy where greed, right, overruns any conception of the public good. And we have corrupt elements from the bottom to the top. So I don't know what the battle will look like in its detail. I just know that we have to fight, if that makes sense. We have to fight for a more just America.
Yeah. Yeah, and once we do reach that reimagined democracy where the value gap is eradicated, do you think that Baldwin's work will continue to provide a lens for future generations to reflect on race and democracy in America?
I pray that he will. I think, you know, as a literary as a literary artist, he offers us, I think, some insight into the human condition. You know, it's like reading Keats, it's like reading Beckett, it's like reading Gogol, right? Read Baldwin. In reading him, you will get some insight into what it means to be a human being, which means some insight in what it means to live between two breaths, two momentous breaths, the first one and the last one, and what you do in between. So I hope so.
Yeah, and also I read part of your book as well, and I wanted to ask you, for someone who, like, let's say, is reckoning with victimization of history, of their own victimization of history, how do you think that they should create that space where they can reckon with that and also understand the vastness of America's state, like Baldwin did when he went off into Paris and had that personal reflection and reflection of the country?
I think, you know, allow yourself the space to reject it so that you can then accept it on your own terms. You know, I think Baldwin, I don't want to call it the luxury. He just took the risk of leaving the United States and going to Paris in 1948. And there he found the space, because he didn't have to deal with the ongoing terror of being Black in the country. He found the space to root out what was in his gut, to throw it all up in some ways. I think part of what we have to do is to figure out how to stand in critical relation to the stories that we've been told about the place and about who we are, so that we can weave our own narratives. And that takes, Gabriella, I think that takes the hard work of self-reflection, and so that you can engage in the inventory of the stories that seemingly move you about and matter to you, so that you can understand them better and perhaps begin to tell yourselves differently, a different story, if that makes sense.
Oh, most definitely. And my final question would have to be, if this person were to experience some sort of guilt in reflecting in this space, what would you say to them?
Oh, guilt is not a very productive emotion or feeling, right? No one is asking for kind of medieval, you know, flagellation. You know, the question is recognizing the trouble, running towards it, and getting beyond it, not leaving it behind, but learning from it. Right? Guilt is a way of assuaging one's conscience, ironically. You know, people like to feel guilty about things, but don't change much.
That's beautifully put. I totally agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Professor. That's all I have on my end.
Thank you so much,
Gabrielle. I
Gabrielle.
appreciate it.
Our next Q&A is from Tess Nuva Shireen, a senior at Brooklyn College. Aaron, do you have her?
Aaron is back there doing his thing.
Hi. Yeah, so I came up with a few questions before this interview, and I feel like you answered some of them, so which is great. So I'm just gonna rephrase them. So this summer I worked for the census, and I noticed that there's a lot of people don't trust the government with their information. And obviously, like as we heard in the news, like it resulted in losing a seat in Congress. So but the thing is that I can't blame those people for not trusting the government, historically speaking, especially the elderly African-American population. So, this will not wanting to trust the government, it comes from wanting to protect yourself, but it comes with a price, such as like whether it's losing Congress seats or not being able to trust a vaccine, even though you want to protect yourself, which made me realize that, being able to trust the government is like a privilege in itself. So my question is, what does the process of reimagining trust in our democracy or government look like for you, especially among the elderly African-American population?
Thank you, Tesniva. That's a wonderful question. I think it actually is, trust is developed, forged in the doing, in the evidence that is seen, known, by way of policy decisions, by way of material transformations in one's life, right? So, it's like, you trust people not just because of their words, you trust people because of their actions. And I think that translates in terms of government, right? So if government has principally been in the business of carcerality, in the business of punishment, and I'm thinking it's not just simply African Americans in the latest census. I think based upon the numbers that we saw out of Arizona and the like, they've undercounted, the Hispanic community in the nation in clear ways, it seems to me. And that makes sense because of what ICE was doing, of what Trump was doing, of what was being, how the census had been politicized in this moment. So the only way trust can be built, it seems to me, is by way of policies that actually result in material transformations of the conditions of people's living. But funded experience will always be present,
Yeah.
And that's what knowledge is funded experience, right? It's the fruit of our undertakings, as Dewey would say. So I'm going to bring that wealth of experience to bear on what's being asked of me now. And until it's proved otherwise, right? I would be less than wise not to pay attention to that funded experience, it seems to me. So you got to earn the trust, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Tesniva.
Thank you, Nadav.
Aaron, I know you wanted to ask a question.
Okay, I got a chance.
Thank
you, Nadav. Okay, so thank you, Professor, over here for coming. We really appreciate it. I want to give a little bit of context to my question. So in the past 24 hours, Senator Tim Scott has said America is not a racist country. And Vice President Harris said on Good Morning America that she agrees with his sentiments, and she does not think that America is a racist country. The exact quote was, well, first of all, no, I don't think America is the racist country, but we also do have to speak the truth about the history of racism in our country. And the question to you would be, how would you answer that? Do you think America is a racist country?
Yes. No, I'm just kidding.
That's true word.
No, yes, of course. I mean, how could it not be? Let me ask you the question. This 1968 was the last major piece of legislation for the Great Society, the Fair Housing Act. 12 years later, Ronald Reagan is elected to undo it all, to undo the Great Society. Now, 1965 is the Voting Rights Act. So from the Civil War amendments to 1965, right? Black folk were not, for the most part, full participants in American democracy. Efforts to remedy, right, racism was kind of compressed in this period that then led to a massive betrayal, which was Reaganism, which is just collapsing. Then we see the insurrection, see the attack on voting rights, we see the Tea Party. The evidence is clear. So the question is, what are they doing? Tim Scott and Vice President Harris. Who are they speaking to when they do that? And so by telling that lie, right, they're trying to make comfortable those people who believe that they're losing grip on the nation. They don't want them to confront what is real. America is systematically racist. We know it. The data is clear, from healthcare to jobs to wealth to education. I could just go down the line, right? So the short answer is yes. And then the long answer is the long answer can be faced with the question. Let's try to figure out what the hell Tim Scott and Vice President Harris are up to. What is the price that they're trying to pay? For what admission? To be admitted to what? Does that make sense, Aaron?
It does. It does. Thank you for that answer.
Yeah.
And you recently argued or talked to Breonna Joy Gray about this. And you also wrote about it in the book and about the swing voter. Right? You don't use that term, but that basically has been handicapped by these group of toddlers who don't want to grow up, and that instead of acquiescing to their wishes, we should push beyond such a categorization.
The Democratic Party is so it's like a scorned lover. You know, they're just obsessed with those Reagan Democrats that rejected them. You know, always trying to get their eye, to show them that they're still beautiful. You know, and so, and it's the center of their politics. And what I want to say is very important here. If the age of Reagan is collapsing, then that configuration of the Democratic Party in response to it is collapsing too. So what we heard from Vice President Harris was a remnant, a feature of that old Democratic Party. And look, there's a way in which you can say that the nation is systematically racist without it being reducible to a condemnation of all people who happen to be white. There's nothing redeemable. I write this in the book. There's nothing redeemable about an idea of whiteness that presupposes that you ought to be valued more than others. There's nothing redeemable about that idea. But that doesn't mean we are irredeemable. You see? It doesn't mean that we are irredeemable. So I find that kind of capitulation loathsome and morally repulsive.
Thank you. Ikra, do you want to ask a question? Or Ethan?
I think there's some great questions from the Q&A section. If you want, Dave, Brian.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you, Ikra. When Baldwin moved, Dave Bryan asks, when Baldwin moved to Paris, he felt free of the day-to-day racism, oppression. As black is interpreted as the opposite of white, Malcolm X noted white is viewed as good, this black is viewed as bad. Should the concept of blackness be shrugged off because it supports the concept of whiteness?
Yeah, I mean, Fanon makes the same point that blackness is the artifice of whiteness. But remember what the passage I read from notes from No Name in the Street, right? That the moment in which we inhabit blackness in such a way that it breaks the hold that a certain imagining of who we are, right? It disrupts the whole thing. So there's a way in which just the declaration of black is beautiful kind of upsets the apple cart, as it were, you know? So there's a way in which we can, like, one can inhabit queerness, one can inhabit, right, a certain understanding of who you are, and invert it. It's the beauty and power of language. So I don't think it should be shrugged off, but it can't become this kind of metaphysical concept that defines who I am in total. As if blackness just swoops down on every baby who happens to be black. And then by definition, we all have the same views, the same cultural tastes, right? The same ability to dance, the same, no. That's nonsense, Baldwin. So that's that metaphysical black, that's that metaphysical black bullshit that Baldwin referred to, right? But that's not what he wants to say. But when blackness it becomes a way of registering a complex and nuanced cultural tradition that gives us some access into the interior lives of those who are a part of this tradition. Now we're talking about a whole different game, you see. So yeah, we're in a whole different terrain. Yeah.
I think
You just muted yourself, Nada.
I think there's one more there's one more question. What would you argue, by Shota Takei, what would you argue is the most important thing each individual should do to create an America we want to live in?
Get clear on your conception of justice. Get clear on what a just society is for you. If you believe that if you work 40 hours a week and you should earn a wage that will allow you to put food on the table and keep a roof over your head, then you need to be fighting for a living wage. If you believe that everyone should be treated equally under the law, then you're supposed to be fighting to banish, racial bias within the criminal justice system and police reform. You're supposed to commit yourself to that. If you believe every human being should have dignity and standing, every human being should be treated as sacred, then you should be fighting for a world where people aren't othered and used as justification for somebody else to feel superior to themselves. If you believe that nobody should go broke because they're sick, what is your conception of justice? Get clear on it and then fight for it. And understand that justice is not charity. It's not something that you do for me. Racial equality is not charity. It's not something you give me. It's not your possession. Right? We need to fight for a more just world together, but you better get clear on it. That's what I think we all need to do. Get clear on it and then fight for the very things that you say you're committed to. Do
you mind if I squeeze just one more question in,
No,
Dr. Glaude?
Not at all.
Okay,
not
okay.
at all.
Well, I was very active during last summer's protests, from day one until there was no steam left and we were just on a bridge. You wrote about how there are some that the identity politics of the Black Lives Matter movement takes away from its more powerful aspects. That there's this that you write how you notice that there's a motivation to self-victimize and to compare each other's traumas and to compete and to find little things to fight over instead of to put that behind us and fight for a bigger cause.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to highlight the perils of a certain kind of easy identity politics, right? Where, where our identities become barriers as opposed to bridges. and where identity becomes a kind of way of an easy kind of way of dealing with very complex problems. But Baldwin says something that I find to be really important, and it comes out of the artist's struggle for integrity. And if I may, I'll read it, and there'll be some great words to end on, right? He says, let me find it, make sure I got it, right? Well, one survives that no matter how. By and by, your uncles and your parents and church stop praying for you. They realize it won't do a bit of good. They give up, they give you up, and you proceed a little further, and your lovers put you down. They don't know what you're doing either, and you can't tell them because you don't know. You survive this, and in some terrible way, which I suppose no one could ever describe, you are compelled, you are corralled, you are bullwhipped into dealing with whatever it is that hurts you. And what is crucial here is that if it hurts you, that's not what's important. Everybody's hurt. What is important, what corrals you, what bullwhips you, what drives you, torments you, is that you must find some way of using this to connect you with everyone else alive. This is all you have to do with it. You must understand that your pain is trivial, except insofar as you can use it to connect with other people's pain. And insofar as you can do that with your pain, you can be released from it. And then hopefully it works the other way around too. Insofar as I could tell you what it is to suffer, perhaps I can help you to suffer less. The bridge, right? Mutuality, solidarity. That's the ground for transformation. Love.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glaude, for your time.
Thank you guys, and y'all stay safe. I appreciate you.
I recommend everyone buy his book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice night.
Take
Goodbye.
care. Bye-bye.